This conference will now be recorded.
Hi all, we're going to give it a few more minutes to let other folks join. We'll start in just a couple minutes here. Okay, we're going to give it just one more minute, but I'm going to ask a favor, and if some of you folks can respond in the affirmative if you're hearing me. We had some issues on our last webinar with the audio, so we may need to go through the computer instead of the conference line we've got set up. So if somebody can just use the chat feature for a couple people and kind of let me know if you're hearing me. Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. Appreciate it. All right. Well, I think I'm just going to go ahead and get started. We will be going through this presentation. Feel free to use the chat function to stop us with questions at any time. We'll try to save the majority of questions for the end, but we realize sometimes it's more relevant to have a question during the presentation. So again, feel free to use the chat. And then at the end, feel free to unmute yourself and just speak up as well. My name is Greg Johnson. I am with the Water Supply Planning section of the Colorado Water Conservation Board. We are here today with I think this is our fourth technical update to the Colorado Water Plan webinar that we're doing. The purpose of these is really to get the word out on how we are doing the analysis for each of the different pieces of this study that we will be releasing about 2 months from now. So we are scheduled to release the full study, all the data, all the documentation on July 18th. This will be the second day of our July board meeting to be held somewhere in the Arkansas Basin, still determining the location there. So today we're going to walk through the environmental and recreational pieces of that study. So I'll talk a little bit about the background, kind of the process and the methodology, and kind of how we're pulling all these different pieces together. I'll keep it pretty brief. We did have a webinar, the first one that we did, I believe, in February, that was focused entirely on how we were doing the whole study and all the different pieces of it. So feel free to go back to that one. All of these are recorded and posted on our website, actually on the Colorado Water Plan website, which is linked from the main CWCB website. Today's webinar will also be posted there, of course, so always feel free to go back. That's also one reason why we have not necessarily been having a very large audience with some of these for the live webinar. We anticipate that a lot of folks have been going back to hit those later. So we'll see how viral those get eventually. Today, as I said, we're going to focus on the environmental and recreational piece of this analysis that really includes two main things. So it's an update to what we had formerly called our non-consumptive database, and then it is for the first time developing an environmental flow tool, similar to some of the work that was done previously through the roundtable process with the watershed flow evaluation tool, if folks have been involved in that process. So again, a reminder that here's the full list of the webinars. So we are right there on the second to last webinar day on May 21st. We do have one final one coming up at the end of June to walk through some of the tools that we've been developing, as well as the next steps and where we're headed. So for everything that we're doing with the water plan and really working on updates in the years ahead, we've been trying to really ramp up our stakeholder engagement as much as possible to maintain the stakeholder momentum that we had building on the water plan, the release of the water plan in 2015. So as we started into the technical update, we started the process off with technical advisory groups that consisted of a number of members from each of the roundtables with a whole lot of the appropriate technical expertise for the main kind of subject matter areas that we were diving into. That really helped us set the foundation for how we were going to really pull the methodologies together for each of these things, how we were going to use the data that we have to then really turn around and quantify the scenario planning approach that we have. So that was very helpful to kick things off. 2018, we really intensified our outreach with the roundtables on kind of how that was all playing out as the study was ramping up. And then this year in 2019, actually late 2018, we did some survey work around what things would look like to potentially update the basin plans, basin implementation plans, and then created for the first time what we were calling an implementation working group to really be the vehicle for getting feedback from the roundtables on how to update those basin plans and what the expectations were, what appropriate things needed to be updated, what did not. And so we've been working through that process, very similar to these tech webinars, monthly, starting in January. Actually, we had a kickoff in December of last year. Had one of those today. Actually, we've been doing those on the same day. Those are also recorded and posted. So feel free if you are interested in more of kind of the process approach of how we are getting through all these different updates to the water plan in the couple of years ahead of us. Feel free to tune into those as well. And it will certainly be an iterative process as we work with the roundtable to get through all these. So all of this, of course, is tied to the water plan itself, published in 2015. Chapter 11 of the water plan is extremely brief, but it does include that table there that lays forth the plan for how we're going to update these different pieces. So we have been doing our best to stick to that timeline of when we start, that the year initiated there, each of these different things. So that being said, we are certainly working on a rebranding effort as well, with the water plan really kind of changing the way that we look at everything as an agency. All of these different studies are really just different parts of the water plan. So we are actually moving on from the term Statewide Water Supply Initiative, SWASI was the acronym. So we are really just focusing on calling this the analysis and technical update to the water plan, to really simplify kind of our approach to the whole process and really run with the water plan branding. And then we will be working on kicking off an update to the water plan proper, the water plan itself, starting next year, that will be a part of the basin plan updates as well. So all be kind of an ongoing iterative effort. Here's just a little bit more detail on that timeline. So we envision in September of this year, we do have a C9 summit. We're calling this our Colorado's 9 Basin Roundtables statewide summit. So this is our big effort to get all the roundtable members together as much as we can to then really walk through the output in this study from the technical update that we will be releasing in July. And at the same time, really pivot and launch directly into kind of using the data, the analysis from this study in the updates to the basin plan. So interpreting what this means locally, how we can improve on the information that we have, and how that can really help inform projects moving forward to help meet some of the needs that have been identified out there. So that will be really the first step, is to update the project list, what we had called the IPPs, the Identified Projects and Processes. We anticipate ideally having contractors hired on board through the end of the calendar year. We're still working on an RFP for what that whole process will look like, but we did get funding through our projects bill this year to really kickstart this whole process. So we're excited to have the resources and kind of have the plan to move this forward, and we'll get through the contracting and then launch into updating projects. And then through 2020, 2021, really get into the meat of updating basin plans using, again, the data coming out of the technical update that we'll release. And then concurrently to really be working with basins, but then really identifying those pieces that will then be pulled directly into the water plan itself, kicking off that conversation in 2020, and wrapping that up by 2022 to try and stay on the timeline there. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Matt Lindberg, who's a principal at Brown and Caldwell, and has been doing a wonderful job as a project manager for the technical team for this update.
Thanks, Greg. I thought I would say a few words about some of the goals of the technical update, and also to talk a little bit about scenario planning and the gap calculations that we're going to be doing, because they're going to be different from what you've seen in the past. So as Greg had mentioned, this is the first update of our data sets since the water plan was published, and it's going to take on a little bit different focus this time around. You probably remember from prior SWASIs, there was a lot in those analyses. There was, not only technical analysis, but there was also implementation recommendations and policy considerations, and some of those components have been moved to other parts of the planning process. So, for example, implementation is a consideration in basin implementation plans. Policy considerations are dealt with in the water plan itself. So, as a result, this technical update is really focused on the development of data sets and tools as opposed to creating portfolios of solutions. Those are the types of things that basin roundtables will do in a collaborative manner. One of the biggest changes that you'll see in this version is the incorporation of scenario planning. And in the middle, sort of bottom part of your screen, there's what we call the cone of uncertainty, and it sort of illustrates some of the concepts of scenario planning. So we have 2018 there on the left, and on the right we have 5 different future scenarios or future kind of states that we might expect to see in the year 2050. And each one of those sort of show up in a different location in that cone, and it's representative of the fact that we don't know what the future is going to hold. We could see a variety of different futures, and the future is driven by a bunch of different considerations, and each one of those drivers has uncertainties involved with them. So scenario planning tries to sort of embrace all of that uncertainty and develop a picture of what the future might look like under different scenarios, and then we can make plans accordingly. One of the main drivers that we'll be looking at this time around, and is a new feature of the technical update, is climate conditions. So we're going to, in the various scenarios, be making different assumptions about what our future climate might be, and those are summarized in the table in the bottom right corner of your screen. 2 of the scenarios are going to have hydrology and demands that are reflective of our current climate conditions, the types of climate factors that we've experienced in the recent past. We have another 2 scenarios that are going to assume a very hot and very dry future, and then we have one that's aptly named in between, and it's really kind of looking at climate conditions between historical and a more extreme look at that. So in order to do this, incorporate the planning scenarios, incorporate climate change, we've really had to move to a set of modeling tools that were developed in Colorado Decision Support System, and we're really leveraging the state's investment in that and using those tools to evaluate how the gaps might change under the different scenarios. A few of the goals that we're meeting with the technical update: one, it will be just to establish a kind of a consistent statewide framework for looking at our water supplies, demands, and future gaps. Another, since this is so technically focused, it's really a big effort is being put into developing usable tools and data sets for roundtables that they can make use of when they update their basin implementation plans. And then there are a few other goals for the technical update that were outlined in the water plan. One is developing a framework for monitoring the drivers that will affect our future conditions, and then using scenario planning and, of course, leveraging the state's investment in tools through the decision support system. So a few words about the gap, and then we'll turn it over to Becky for our feature presentation today. The results of our gap analyses are going to be different from what you've seen before. On the left side of your screen is what's been called the wedge diagram, and it really depicts our future gaps. It looks at existing supplies, yields we might get from identified projects and processes, and shows emerging gap. And it's based on some assumptions of low, medium, and high, I guess, conditions for some of the different drivers. It was a great analysis that leveraged the tools we had available to us at the time, but we have new tools available now, and the water plan laid out this framework for looking at the 5 different planning scenarios. And so that's the challenge this time around. As Greg mentioned early on in the project, we spent a lot of time developing methodologies, and that was necessary because these planning scenarios are really in narrative format in the water plan. So we had to look at those narratives, those stories, and figure out how to turn that into numbers and be able to quantify what our future state might look like. And so we had a lot of input on how to do that. And we've since done a lot of modeling. When we get to the end of this process here in the next little under 2 months, we'll have some pretty rich data sets that allow us to compare supplies, demands, and gaps across the different scenarios, but also within the scenarios. We'll have information on, within a specific scenario, what our supplies, demands, and gaps look like in wet years, and average years, and dry years. We'll have a whole lot of information that roundtables can use for their future planning. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Becky Donovan. She's with CDM Smith, and their project manager in developing some of the environmental and recreational tools. Has been doing a great job at that. And so without further ado, turn it over to Becky.
Thanks. Thanks everyone for calling in today, and for any of those that are listening to this at a later date. As Matt said, I'm Becky Donovan. I'm the project manager for the environmental and recreational tasks that the CDM team has completed under this technical update. The CDM team has included a number of our in-house staff, along with participation and input from the Nature Conservancy. In particular, Meg White and John Sanderson have helped us out, along, of course, with collaboration with the technical advisory groups and with CWCB. So for this discussion, the agenda is as follows. We're going to walk through the 2 tools that we've updated and developed as part of the technical update. The tools to be discussed today are the ENR database and the environmental flow tool. As the agenda shows, we'll review methodology, review previous work, and the current enhancements that have gone into the database, and then focus on the environmental flow tool. Specifically what it is not, the data inputs, and review a summary of the tool outputs. The methodologies for updating the environmental and recreational tools were developed with the intent to help guide the basin roundtables in updating their basin implementation plans to prioritize and implement environmental and recreational projects. The intent is for the tools to provide data sets for environmental and recreational projects and methods that are consistent, quantitative, and publicly accessible. As discussed on the previous slide, the technical update of the environmental and recreational methodology focused on enhancements to the ENR database and the development of an environmental flow tool. The methodologies were developed collaboratively with technical advisory groups and built on previous non-consumptive needs and ENR efforts. Both tools are built on a legacy of stakeholder involvement using existing data. The methodology for the ENR database focused on 3 success factors. We'll discuss each of those factors in more details on the following slides. Those factors are creating an enhanced technical foundation, making an engaging tool with a meaningful user experience, and having a tool available that integrates into the Colorado water planning process. The methodology for the environmental flow tool focused on developing a tool that would assess potential risks associated with flow changes projected for the planning scenarios, which could aid in ENR project refinement, categorization, and prioritization. In the past, the term non-consumptive has also been used in place of environmental and recreation. There were a number of non-consumptive needs methods and products developed under the SWASI 2010 effort. The non-consumptive needs assessment utilized environmental and recreational mapping tools developed during SWASI 2 as a common technical platform to identify non-consumptive focus areas within the basin. Basins chose to map focus areas based on hydrologic unit codes, or HUCs, and/or stream segments. The map shown here is the compilation of those efforts and the product of that focus area mapping. During the SWASI 10 process, the Basin Roundtables also identified projects and methods required to meet the non-consumptive needs identified as part of the non-consumptive needs focus area mapping. Stakeholders provided data through surveys, which was then digitized for mapping and compiled into the database. The content of the database was gathered through a stakeholder-driven effort, and CDM Smith began database development in 2010 to assist in the internal management of non-consumptive data received from the Basin Roundtables. So the methodology for updating the ENR database, as we discussed before, outlined 3 success factors, which we'll focus on in the next few slides. But again, those were creating an enhanced technical foundation. That involved updating the spatial unit of analysis and updating data processing procedures, providing an engaging and meaningful user experience through the development of Excel-based templates for loading data, defined reports for easy retrieval of data, and making the data easily accessible through online mapping tools, and creating opportunities for user feedback. The third and final success factor was to have a product that could be integrated into the Colorado water planning process, with the intent to improve the content and expand project information within the database. So data processing procedures are critical to ensure accuracy, promote data quality, and create a process that can be adopted through training. A data loading procedure was developed to provide instructions and guidance for loading data into the database, be it new data or updates to existing data. The procedure streamlines the data loading process, facilitates transparency with the process, and improves the quality of data. Excel-based data loading templates have been developed in coordination with ongoing IPMP database development so that ENR data are consistent and comparable for any future coordinated efforts. The previous non-consumptive database utilized the spatial unit of analysis based on USGS National Hydrologic Database, the NHD. Specifically, it used a field called the Common ID, or COM-ID. This stream-based spatial unit code was retired by USGS, so it required an update to the spatial unit of analysis within the enhanced database. The database now uses both the source water route framework and NHD for spatial reference. The source water route framework is a Colorado product, and it's a spatial data set developed based on where water rights exist. So as the data are expanding, they can be added to the database, but we also kept NHD reference for the maximum coverage. So data in the database can be queried by hydrologic unit code and or stream segment. A successful, engaging, and meaningful user experience occurs when a user can provide and or retrieve information from the database. So for the ENR database, the intended users are the Basin Roundtable members, members of their basin implementation teams, for example, consultants and stakeholders, and those involved in the creation of stream management plans. We have made Excel-based templates, user-friendly for data loading, to streamline the data loading process and to increase data integrity through validation functions. There's also standard reports. These are, again, Excel-based reports that can be used to retrieve data to be used for analysis. The focus of these reports is to provide the data for analysis in the next round of basin implementation plans. The standard reports will ensure that the users are receiving a consistent data set across the board as part of the basin implementation planning process and are able to report back additional project protections and attribute information. Another component of this is using an online mapping tool. So spatial data from the database will be viewable through the existing CWCB data viewer. We have an example screenshot of what that viewer looks like and the web link provided there on the screen. Data viewing through the CWCB data viewer benefits the roundtables and the basin implementation planning process by providing an interactive visualization tool for retrieving data. There's also a component of feedback. So the database developments and enhancements are an iterative process, and feedback from the Basin Roundtable members and other users can help gauge the usefulness of the database and identify additional future needs. Updates and enhancements are ongoing, and feedback may be solicited in a number of ways, potentially through surveys, continued outreach to users, and providing contact information at user endpoints such as the online mapping tool. The final success factor is integration into the Colorado water planning process. Again, as I said before, the environmental and recreational database is evolving. It's important to be forward-thinking in the development of the database to provide a scalable platform. Improving database content included updates to the environmental and recreational attributes. The existing attributes list was consolidated to a manageable and consistent format across all basins to promote a unified language for attribute identification. Previous non-consumptive needs assessment efforts ended up with over 100 environmental and recreational attributes. So the original attributes were reviewed and quality checked to identify repetitive or unreliable data sources and data sets. Closely related attributes that provided repetitive or overlapping data were consolidated into a single attribute. Additionally, previous attributes that did not have public data sources or data sets available to confirm spatial data were archived. A number of attributes were also renamed to better reflect the data set and simplify database development. The final 58 attributes were then grouped into macro categories that help increase organization within the database and also provide a foundation for the environmental flow tool that we'll discuss later in the presentation. On this slide, we're showing 6 of the macro categories. Just for reference, these are the macro attribute categories that were also used in the flow tool. There's certainly a number of other macro categories, and I think off the top of my head, they're wildlife, maybe important wilderness areas, just as some examples of those categories. Another component of the integration into Colorado's water planning process is the expansion of project information. So the intent at the beginning of this process was to include and enhance the project information that's in the database. But under this effort, we reviewed existing basin implementation plans, and to be honest, there was a lot of inconsistent information, inconsistent naming conventions, lack of spatial reference, project data. So project data ultimately were not updated in this version of the database. However, as part of the data loading and retrieval efforts under the other tasks we just discussed, these Excel-based loading templates have been developed in conjunction, again, with the IPMP database efforts, so that future iterations of the database can be expanded to include consistent project information to support planning for both consumptive and non-consumptive needs. So that is what I have for the database review, and we'll switch gears here to talk about the environmental flow tool, the other task we had under this effort. So in addition to updating the database, this technical update included the development of an environmental flow tool. It's designed to assess flow conditions in each basin. The flow tool can serve as a resource to help basin roundtables refine, categorize, and prioritize their current and future portfolio of environmental and recreational projects and methods through a better understanding of flow needs based on scenario planning outcomes and modeling. The flow tool uses hydrologic data from the DSS and the modeled flow projections for the 5 planning scenarios, along with established flow ecology relationships to assess risks to the macro attribute categories at 54 pre-selected gauges across the state. We'll go into that in a little more detail, but first, an important discussion to have is what the flow tool is and what the flow tool is not. So the environmental flow tool is a high-level tool that builds on previous efforts. As Greg mentioned earlier, the watershed flow evaluation tool was developed to offer an approach to conducting a watershed scale, science-based assessment of flow-related ecology risk throughout a basin, particularly when site-specific studies were sparse. The watershed flow evaluation tool provided a framework for assessing environmental flow needs at a regional scale. So this environmental flow tool, completed under this technical update, builds on that watershed flow evaluation tool to apply established flow ecology relationships at nodes in each basin to estimate risks to key categories of ENR attributes under modeled flows for the 5 planning scenarios. Again, those are business as usual, weak economy, cooperative growth, adaptive innovation, and hot growth. The tool takes DSS-based projections and post-processes the hydrology data to provide summaries of changes in monthly flows at pre-selected nodes for the planning scenarios. The tool then identifies potential risks through the flow ecology calculation projections. The flow tool is meant to be a complementary tool to the DSS that can assist roundtables, again, to refine, categorize, and prioritize projects and inform scenario planning and decision-making. And then what the tool is not. We want to emphasize that the flow tool is not prescriptive. It does not designate any gap values, nor does it provide the basis for any regulatory actions. The tool does not identify areas where ecological change may be associated with factors other than stream flow. Summary results from the tool are not interchangeable with site-specific analysis. The tool's been built in Excel using Visual Basic, and it has user-friendly form-based interface functionality. Users can select nodes, scenarios, and calculation periods of interest. It was built with a number of data inputs. Here we're showing the flow tool nodes. Again, these were pre-selected and are included in the tool. There's 54 nodes. The CDM Smith team worked collaboratively with CWCB and also Wilson Water Group to review available attribute data, so where key environmental and recreational attributes are located and concentrated within a basin, also considering spatial coverage across basins, and then an assessment of data availability. So some sites that were initially selected may have been eliminated due to data gaps or a small period of record. The inputs also included the results of modeling efforts. So the previous webinars that have talked about population, supply, demand projections covered, again, in the previous webinars. All this information went into the modeled flow under all the different scenarios, and this data was loaded into the environmental flow tool. And note that the Arkansas and Rio basins do not have models to support the scenario forecasting at this time. So in lieu of those modeled scenario data, climate change data were used. So baseline data were used for business as usual and weak economy. Naturalized in between was used for cooperative growth, and hot and dry was used for adaptive innovation and hot growth. In addition to assessing risk through flow ecology relationships, the tool provides statistical flow summaries. We show an example here, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in the output discussion. And then the other main input here is these flow ecology relationships. They're well established. They're drawn from previous applications, including, again, the watershed flow evaluation tool, the non-consumptive toolbox, and non-consumptive sections of the Colorado Water Plan. The relationships are applied to the modeled flow data in the tool to help identify potential risks of future changes in flow to key environmental and recreational macro attribute categories. These categories were cold water, warm water, and plains fish, riparian and wetland species, in-stream flow rates, and boating. The tool highlights the risks based on percent changes to the key metrics. So from synthesizing all these input data, the output summaries include flow statistics. There's 10-year average, 3-year average, monthly flow distribution, monthly mean, monthly and annual flow totals. There is an environmental flow analysis tab, which includes the percent change for key metrics across planning scenarios. The results are shaded by risk category. Those categories we're showing here in the graphic: low, moderate, less moderate, high, very high ecology risk due to flow changes. There's also a chart for impairment anomalies. So this provides analysis on the drivers of the future flow changes. They could be no change. There could be no change, or a change related to timing of flows, or a change related to depletions caused by either climate change or consumptive use. The flow change also may be a combination of timing and depletion related. So there's a chart that shows what the driving factors are there. There's a hydrologic classification table. It shows wet, dry, average, drought, or flood for every modeled month across each planning scenario. And there's also a regulatory low flow summary. It just shows changes in low flow events. So, for example, the 2, 5, 10, 25, 50, and 100-year events under each planning scenario. And so with that, I can open it up for questions.
Great, thanks, Becky and Matt. I think that was a great summary of the flow tool as well as the database work. So we're certainly excited to get this out when we have everything released, again in July 18th, with our official launch for the study. But we are available for any questions that you all may have, and certainly you know where to find us after the fact too. So always feel free to give us a call or send us an email. So feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to, verbally ask a question. Again, the chat feature works well. So any questions, comments, thoughts? Hopefully we didn't put you all to sleep. It's a lot of information. And I'll add again that we will be posting this webinar, will be a YouTube link. So for future reference, if we were talking too fast or you didn't quite catch something, you can always go back and scroll through. We also have been posting the PDF version of the presentations as well. So that will be available hopefully within the next day or two up on our website.
Yeah.
Oh, Megan already has it posted. She's on it. Thanks, Megan. All right, well, we will give it a few more minutes of embrace the awkward silence, and we'll call it in a few minutes here.
Processing all the information.
Yeah.
Can you put up the slide with the link to the viewer?
Yeah.
That as well. A question from Ryan. Is the viewer fully up and running, or is it still in the process of development?
Well, the viewer exists already. The attribute information and database information is not loaded yet, but is anticipated to be available when this all gets put out.
Yeah, good question, Ryan. So the viewer is an existing CWCB product that we've been developing in conjunction with Division Water Resources. So all sorts of great data is already up on there, and that's been evolving over the last handful of years, and frankly, it's been getting a lot more powerful. So that we're using that as a vehicle to post this data from our study, from this tech update to the water plan. So we will be posting that in July when we have the study released. And on that note as well, one thing I forgot to mention is that we're releasing the study and all the documentation and whatnot in July of this year, but we do have kind of a follow-up effort that will be ideally later this calendar year, potentially into maybe first quarter of next year, that will be a more attractive online visualization. So we're working on an RFP process right now. I'm trying to get a firm on board to really help with a kind of a modern website layout, something that goes kind of above and beyond our typical website certainly, but even Esri Story Map, if you're familiar with those. But a way to really display and kind of understand and visualize all the data that we'll have. So stay tuned on that front. But we just didn't have that ready this summer, unfortunately.
Hi, Greg. Kevin McBride here. I got a couple questions for you.
Sure, go ahead.
So at the end, there was a slide about the information that came out of the watershed flow evaluation tool. And so the watershed flow evaluation tool is going to be used statewide. Is that correct?
Well, this is a separate tool that's sort of building on those previous efforts. It uses the same, I'm trying to find maybe that tool. It uses the same basis for the calculations, the flow ecology relationships. The flow evaluation tool was really focused on a basin scale. This tool includes data and nodes across the state. This tool also incorporates the modeled flows for the planning scenarios, which weren't part of the watershed flow evaluation tool. So it's similar, but it's a separate tool, and it sort of builds on the work that was laid, the foundation that was laid, putting that tool together.
Okay, yeah, we actually ran that up here in the Yampa some years ago. I think it was still under development. I know the model was, and so I don't know that we've used it on any of the final model runs. But my question is, if it looked like it was going to be available to use in any basin in the state, I guess is what I should say. But some of the basins aren't modeling, and so I was just curious as to wouldn't a model be necessary to run this tool, or are there other ways to use it?
So this tool comes preloaded with all of the data, and then on this slide, I sort of talked through the information and mentioned that the Arkansas and Rio don't have models at this time, but in lieu of that data, we've used climate change data. So baseline data were used for business as usual and weak economy. Naturalized in between was used for cooperative growth, and naturalized hot dry was used for adaptive innovation and hot growth. And those are noted in the tool, footnoted on the environmental flow tab that shows results. So the data we have for all the other basins at the selected nodes are loaded, and then there are maybe 2 or 3 nodes that were selected high up in the Rio and Arkansas, so they wouldn't have effects caused by other things. So the climate change drivers were put in, just for some reference and some information.
Okay, so the flows that are in there for those ones come from, do all of them come from something besides CDSS models, or are you using CDSS models in the basins where they're available?
It's all DSS.
Okay. And then it looked like and I don't know if that was just an example, but it looked like in the slide that you showed that the business as usual and the weak economy, had less impact on whatever it was that you were. I didn't actually catch what that was for.
Yeah. And this was just an example to sort of illustrate how the data outputs will look. Certainly this will look different for any, this is as I said, it's user defined. So you select a node, you select what scenarios you're analyzing and for what date range you're interested in. And this is an example of what the results would look like. We'll also have an option to turn on the actual percent data that, changes the colors and what we've categorized as the different risk categories. Also, not all nodes have every macro attribute category applicable there. So, this will look different for each node, and this is just an example.
Okay, so the fact that business as usual looks better than cooperative growth in this particular example is not really meaningful. It doesn't mean that the decision on which hydrology to use from the scenario is what's really going to be driving this output.
So, can you say that again?
Well, I mean, in your earlier slide when you talked about what scenario had what hydrology in it,
Mm-hmm.
then taking that to this particular slide, it would look like weak economy and business as usual, if I remember correctly, had the same hydrology as compared to the other ones, which had, hot and dry in 4 and 5 and in between in 3. So in this particular slide, assuming all the other assumptions were the same, it would look like the decision on hydrology would be, the biggest driver, in which case it's really not giving us any information about any particular management strategy, and so this is a conversation that, I've had with Greg for quite some time about scenarios versus, using a long-term hydrologic record. But anyway, I know we're going to get into doing models and picking a scenario. I'm not sure how we'll do that, but anyway, in this slide, it looks like business as usual, which, if I remember correctly, has often been not the outcomes we wanted in an overall management scheme, looked better for the environment, which I found surprising. So anyway, just asking that question. See where I'm going?
Yeah. Hey, Kevin, this is Greg. I would. Those are all great points, but I would say that it gets complicated pretty quickly, just due to the nature of scenario planning. So you're right. Hydrology is a huge driver, But business as usual, for example, does not include climate change as part of that analysis. And then, of course, as part of scenario planning, we have any number of other things factored into the modeling effort. So in some ways, when we were starting to play with this tool, and we're still refining things and working on all the, the data, and let alone writing the report to get everything out, in time to meet that deadline. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but just in our kind of initial analyses going through, looking at some of the results from the tool and this flow tool specifically, things are not always as intuitive as you might think they would be. And I think the simple answer is that, with scenario planning has its many pros and cons, but one of maybe the potential cons is that, sometimes things can cancel each other out when you have those different variables turned up or down in different ways. So you do get some interesting results, and I think this flow tool will hopefully add a lot of value to, at least illustrate the potential picture moving forward a little bit better. But I think, as Becky did a good job describing everything, it's certainly not the end-all be-all. It's not prescriptive, and probably most importantly for folks who are really kind of technically in this realm, is that it's, it's all based on monthly data. So, you really need site-specific daily analyses if you're really going to look at some of these environmental attributes and flow issues in certain places.
I might add one more thing too. It depends, what this little matrix, this colored matrix looks like is really going to depend on, in a lot of basins, the location in the basin that you're looking at. In this example here, if you were further down in a basin where there's lots of water management activities that influence stream flows, we could have different colors in scenario 1, business as usual, or weak economy, because those each incorporate different assumptions on demands, and demands are going to affect stream flows. And so you could have different risks, across the scenarios. Even if your hydrology in general, your assumptions about water supply are the same, your assumptions on demands are different in each scenario. So, like Greg said, it gets pretty complicated.
Yeah, we as I say, we have used this already in a model that we ran, and had some significant questions about it. But just for example, you could take a scenario 4, and I'm just wondering if you could do this, and then in a basin have different modeling or different management options. Building a reservoir, drying up agriculture, turning off a city, whatever you chose in the modeling realm, and rerun that CDSS model, and then use this tool on top of it. Is it set up to do that?
Yes, it can be. So, like I said, we've preloaded 54 nodes and the data associated with them, but it is set up so that different modeling outputs can be put in and run for information, and like you said, for decision-making, planning decisions. Different data can be input and see what your results are.
So potentially that's something that we could do as part of the basin plan update process if there, if a roundtable had a strong desire to do so, which I think is a really good point that, a lot of these tools, this one in particular, we really see as, informing that process. And then it may not be the kind of thing that you have, dozens and dozens of people becoming familiar with, but you might have a handful of folks who are, really excited about it or really, using it as part of that basin plan update process. Same thing with the database. And also I should point out that, as we get into the kind of the contracting for updating the water plan itself as well as the basin plans, we really hope to have, the resources with the technical team, with the contracting team to take some of the heavy lifting off of the roundtable members, so that you would have, folks that you could direct to do some of this work, that you wouldn't have to spend the volunteer hours doing any of this.
Yeah, like I say, we've done this already, running different outputs against boating in, for example, that was based upon a pretty detailed assessment by American Whitewater of, what good boating flows were. So, this could be used similarly to that. And, we did that on some earlier runs, but the models weren't as well fleshed out as they are now. So, all right, thanks very much.
Yep, thanks, Kevin. I appreciate it. And it's always a good dialogue. I know you guys are definitely a few steps ahead of most roundtables as far as modeling is concerned. So it's good to have that perspective. We had a question through the chat from Ryan. Is there an intent to develop models for the Arc and Rio basins? Yes, absolutely. Work has been occurring for many years in the Rio Grande Basin. I'm going to get over my head very quickly trying to discuss the details of that, but long story short, there are a lot of legal issues down there tied to the groundwater management subdistricts and tied to the compact. So that current draft model is not available for use, was not available for us to use in this study. But someday, at some point, hopefully that model will be released. And then the Arkansas Decision Support System model is well underway. I think that project kicked off a few years ago, but it's kind of a long, complicated process to pull the model together and get all the data situated, get everything calibrated in there. So that is ongoing. And I do not know, unfortunately, the timeline for when that will be finished. But the hope is certainly by the next time around, when we update our analysis, that we'll be ready to go. So stay tuned on that front, but we'll be working with the Arkansas Basin Roundtable as that model is finally finished up. All right, any other questions, comments? Well, thanks to everyone for the engagement, for being on the line. And again, please feel free to track us down, give us a call, send us an email. Just let us know any other thoughts, comments, feedback that you might have on this. But thanks again.